Hello students, this is Professor McDermott. Well, once again we've got a grab bag of topics of interest in 19th century American history. Evangelical Unionism, separate spheres, the anti-slavery movement, and manifest destiny. So we'll take these one by one, starting with Evangelical Unionism. What was that? Well, it was largely the creation of this man, the Reverend Lyman Beecher, who was the most famous minister in America during this period, and his whole family became very famous. For example, one of his daughters, Harriet Beecher Stowe, wrote a little book called Uncle Tom's Cabin about slavery that some people thought actually had a big impact in creating the Civil War. And other members of his family were also very influential people including Catherine Beecher. One of the groups read an article by Catherine Beecher. She was also Lyman Beecher's daughter. So evangelical unionism, well, first, an evangelical is a Christian, the type of Christian who believes that you need to be born again, have that kind of spiritual rebirth experience. So evangelicals were the kind of Christians who participated in the revivals of the Second Great Awakening during the early 1800s. And the unionism part means that these evangelical Christians were starting to get organized because they really wanted to change society, change America, change the world. And a lot of that impulse was motivated by a very famous book that Lyman Beecher came out with in 1835 called A Plea for the West. Now, at this point in time, the West really meant the Mississippi Valley. Missouri, especially, Lyman Beecher was very interested in because St. Louis, Missouri, had always been a fairly Catholic city. I mean, it had been founded by the French and then inhabited by the Spanish, so there were lots of Catholics there already. But Lyman Beecher believed that more and more Catholic immigrants from places like Ireland and other Catholic countries in Europe were starting to come to the Mississippi Valley, and that really alarmed him. Like many Protestant Americans of his time, Lyman Beecher didn't think Catholics could be good citizens of the United States because, in his mind, they owed total obedience to the Pope in everything, including political matters. And as a matter of fact, Beecher even had a theory that the Pope himself was planning to move out of Rome and establish his new headquarters in St. Louis, Missouri. Sounds ridiculous, but that's how far this fear and hatred and paranoia about Catholics went among Protestant Americans in the 19th century. To be fair, a lot of Catholics hated Protestants as well. There was just a lot of hostility between Catholics and Protestants at this time. But this hatred of Catholics began to be called nativism. And many Protestant Americans believed that only native-born Protestant Americans should be able to vote and have political privileges. So that feeling became known as nativism. But anyway, Beecher and his followers who read the book decided to take some constructive action to try to prevent these Catholics who supposedly were flooding into the Mississippi Valley from converting people to Catholicism. And also they hoped to convert some Catholics to the Protestant form of Christianity. So in order to achieve these ends, these evangelicals began to found a whole bunch of new organizations, what we call voluntary associations in America. And you see some examples here on the screen. There were many, but here are just a few examples. The American Home Missionary Society, this was a group that sent out missionaries um, knocking on people's doors, basically, trying to evangelize and bring them the Christian message according to the Protestant um, version of the Bible. Kind of like today, groups like Jehovah's Witnesses and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints also do that kind of door-to-door ministry. So the American Home Missionary Society, excuse me, the American Bible Society, you know, a lot of these groups are actually still around nowadays, and this is one of them. You may have seen them handing out those little green New Testaments on campus. That happens from time to time. I have a few in my desk drawer. They're a society that basically just prints up Bibles and distributes them for free. So, again, the Bible, as the basis of Christian faith, being especially important to Protestant Christians. So this, especially at that time in history, so this group was trying to spread the Protestant version of Christianity by distributing Bibles. The American Sunday School Union. If any of you have ever gone to Sunday school, you have this group to thank for it, because they were the ones who invented the idea that when people go to church on Sunday, they shouldn't just go to a worship service. Children and even sometimes adults should also be expected to attend a class on the Bible or a class on Christian teaching, and that is what we call Sunday school. So this group founded that whole idea of Sunday school. Finally, a very important group socially and politically, the American Temperance Union. Now, at this point in history, temperance, that word became associated with the idea that nobody should drink alcohol. And well, actually, it really started with the idea that nobody should drink hard liquor. But then it gradually expanded to include the idea that people should just swear off drinking any alcohol at all, including beer and wine. And then eventually the temperance advocates began agitating for a total ban on manufacturing or selling alcohol in the United States, and in fact eventually succeeded in getting an amendment to the Constitution passed, which did just that for 13 years, from 1920 to 1933, and we call that period Prohibition. So this was a very large and very successful movement, and many of its members were, in fact, women. Now, that may seem kind of strange, because you remember we already talked about the whole idea of separate spheres for men and women, the idea that men's sphere was to go out in public to do political things or to do business or so forth, whereas women's sphere was supposedly entirely within the home. So why were these women going out of the homes and getting involved in groups like this, and even groups with a political edge like the American Temperance Union? Well, first of all, you can see why temperance, alcohol, would be a big issue for women. A lot of women were just fed up because their husbands were drinking up the paycheck so that they never saw any of it. Coming home drunk, being abusive to them and to their children, and a lot of women had just had enough, and so this temperance movement became predominantly a women's movement, and that did give many women a reason to go outside the home and to get involved in activism, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But first, a little more on this separate spheres idea and how it really took root in the 19th century. I mean, this idea that men and women had separate roles had been around for a long time, but work conditions in the 19th century really tended to exaggerate it even more. Okay, Okay, so remember, before the Industrial Revolution, practically everybody worked at home. You know, even if you were in a workshop, say, making clothes or something like that, you tended to live in the workshop with the master of the workshop and his wife, and work in the same place. So everybody basically was working from home before the Industrial Revolution. But when factories began to be built, that really changed work life for a lot of people. So you didn't live in the factory. Nobody lived in the factory. You had to have a home separate from that. So the workers lived in, poorer neighborhoods, and they would go to work from there. But also the bosses and the secretaries and the accountants and so forth, who were running the factory, they would tend to live in more middle class neighborhoods, separate from the workers who lived in a different neighborhood. And the men who had jobs like that would, of course, have to leave the home to go to work. And because they were pretty prosperous, their wives didn't have to go to work. So the wives would just stay at home, take care of the house, order around the servants if they had any servants, and take care of the children. And so this really tended to increase the separation of the spheres, because now men and women were separate for most of the day. The man at work, the woman at home. Now, I do want to really emphasize that this only applied to middle class people, because for the poorer working class families in the cities and towns, a lot of times the women also had to work just to make ends meet. So they would also go to the factories alongside their husbands. And actually, most of the time, even the kids were also working, and they would have factory jobs. So men, women, and children from the poorer classes would all go together to work. So they actually were not leading separate lives. It's just that they were all together in the factory rather than at home. And of course, farmers continued as they had, for millennia, to work at home, so that all, the whole family was together, men, women, and children working at home. So this separation only applied to the middle class. However, of course, it was the middle class who were writing the books and editing the newspapers and the magazines and so forth. And so this concept became very influential. And the idea that women really shouldn't leave the house because, in fact, they were so pure and they were so good, so much better than men morally, that if women did leave the house, they would be shocked by what they saw in this dog-eat-dog world. So really they had to stay at home because they were too delicate, they were too sensitive, to ever leave the house. And so this idea, as it developed, um, really became a conviction that women were actually more moral, more ethical, better people spiritually than their husbands. Some writers began to call women the angels in the house because they were supposedly so much better than men. So you see a very exaggerated, somewhat extreme version of the separate spheres idea taking root here. Some people still hold to this idea, although in modern America, once again, it's become very difficult for men to make a living for the whole family just on one salary. So most women, even if they have a husband, now have to work. And then, of course, there are many single-parent families as well, where mothers are heroically working to take care of their children without any help. And so this idea, this separation, really rarely exists in modern American society, but many people still do believe in it. It's a very deeply rooted notion. Um, However, and here we get back to the idea of women engaging in social reform activities and even political projects. Some women in the mid 19th century began to kind of turn this separate spheres idea on its head and actually use it as an excuse or justification for them going out of the house and getting involved in reform movements. And the argument they made went something like this. They said, okay, men, you think that we're more moral than you. You think we're better people than you. We have this great moral insight. Well, then, isn't it our duty as women to go out of the house and to try to change the whole society, not just take care of our family, our kids, but to help other people's children, to help other women, and the entire American society to get better, to become more moral and more ethical. And so, increasingly, as the century went on, many women did just that and got involved in movements like the anti-slavery movement. In fact, when the first Women's Rights Convention met in the year 1848 at Seneca Falls, New York, most of the women who attended that conference, women like Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, had already been involved in the anti-slavery movement, and now they were launching their own separate feminist movement, if you will. So this strong presence of women in the anti-slavery movement is something we need to be aware of as we get into talking about that movement. How did the anti-slavery movement really begin to take off finally during the 1830s? Well, a lot of it actually had to do with an event that was instigated by slaves themselves in the state of Virginia in 1831, led by a slave minister whose name was Nat Turner. Nat Turner began to get visions from God telling him that it was time for African American slaves to rise up in revolt and to free themselves from the shackles of slavery. And so, influenced by these messages from God, Nat Turner collected some supporters and followers, and they did revolt in 1831 and killed 57 whites on the plantations there in Virginia. There was a movie a few years ago that came out called The Birth of a Nation about the Nat Turner Rebellion. You may have seen it. Well, in any case, the outcome wasn't good for Nat Turner and his followers. He was captured and executed, and the movement did not succeed. However, it had a ripple effect throughout American society, really very profound consequences. In the South, Southern whites became completely paranoid that another Nat Turner revolt was about to happen. And so there was a huge backlash against slaves and free blacks all over the South. Some groups are going to read a chapter from Harriet Jacobs's autobiography that talks about this mistreatment of African Americans in the wake of the Nat Turner Rebellion. Many states passed laws forbidding any kind of abolitionist literature from coming into the South because they blamed the Nat Turner Rebellion on the writings of Northern anti-slavery people coming into the South. And one of those Northern anti-slavery writers who was inspired by the Nat Turner Rebellion was a man named William Lloyd Garrison, who in that same year, 1831, started a newspaper in Boston, an anti-slavery newspaper called The Liberator. And he made it very clear from the very first issue of The Liberator that he was not going to pull any punches. He said, quote, "I will not equivocate." That means I won't waffle. I will not excuse, I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard. End quote. Yeah, so he was going to spread that uncompromising anti-slavery message no matter what anyone thought of it. Garrison is a fascinating character. He was a fanatic, really, in a good way. I think American society always needs to have a few fanatics like William Lloyd Garrison to shake things up and to stir people in their consciences. Here's another statement by Garrison. In 1837, he said, quote, "Our doom as a nation is sealed. The day of our probation has ended, and we are not saved." Now, that was a very strong statement at that time because, in terms of people's strong Christian beliefs at that time, when you tell someone you are not saved, you're really telling them they're going to hell, right? Essentially what Garrison is saying here is like, we're doomed. God is angry at us. He's mad at us because of this terrible sin of slavery. And if we don't do something about it, we are all white Americans are going to end up in hell as punishment for this terrible, terrible crime. In fact, at one point, Garrison actually burnt a copy of the United States Constitution in public. And as he did so, he called the Constitution of the United States, quote, "a covenant with death and an agreement with hell," end quote. Now, can you imagine if a modern American politician or public figure said those words, the huge outcry there would be? But Garrison actually said that. The Constitution is a covenant with death and an agreement with hell. Because, as we've seen, it had those three clauses that supported slavery. And so, when Garrison founded his great anti-slavery group, the American Anti-Slavery Society, in 1833, he encouraged its members not to participate in politics in any way, not to vote, not to run for office, because in his mind, the entire American political system was corrupted by its association with slavery. And therefore, if you were a good Christian and an anti-slavery person, you should simply refuse to cooperate with the government in any way. And so the members of the American Anti-Slavery Society were apolitical. That is, they didn't get involved in politics. They tried to promote their cause of ending or really restricting slavery through other means, more or less through persuasion and evangelization. I do want to mention at this point, I know that in the lower grades probably you've heard this movement called the abolition movement. And I don't like to use that term actually because there were very few Americans, at least this early in the 1830s, who actually believed in the total abolition of slavery, that slavery should be abolished everywhere it existed. Most of the people, even within this anti-slavery movement, wouldn't go that far. They would say, well, we should restrict the spread of slavery. We should restrict slavery from spreading any further, say into the territories that aren't states yet. Or they would make arguments like the internal slave trade that should be abolished. Nobody should be allowed to buy or sell slaves. Or that slavery should be banned in certain places, like the District of Columbia, the national capital. But very few people at this point would actually come out or go as far as saying that slavery should be totally banned. Garrison was one of them. But very few of his fellow anti-slavery people did that. So I prefer that term anti-slavery movement rather than abolition movement for that reason. But even though their goals were very moderate at first, anti-slavery people were hated, harassed, and persecuted throughout the country. I mean, not just in the South, but in the free states of the North as well. And here's a very powerful example of that. Excuse me. In Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, a new building was opened in May of 1838. It was called Pennsylvania Hall, and it was basically just like a conference center that was built so that anti-slavery groups could have meetings and conferences there. And the first actual anti-slavery meeting that was held there was of a women's anti-slavery group, and the keynote speaker at this conference was a woman named Angelina Grimke Weld, who's a fascinating character. She and her sister Sarah Grimke had grown up on a slave plantation in the South, but they were disgusted and horrified by slavery, so they both became Quakers and moved to the North and became prominent anti-slavery speakers, which was very controversial because not just because of the anti-slavery, but because at that time women were not supposed to speak in public. That was considered to be scandalous, especially if they spoke to a mixed group of both men and women. And so Angelina Grimke Weld was very controversial to begin with. But anyway, while she was giving her speech in Pennsylvania Hall, a large mob gathered outside that building with torches, and they began shouting and screaming and throwing rocks at the windows and so forth. And finally, they broke into the building. They ordered all the women to leave, and then they set the building on fire and burnt it to the ground. Now, this happened in Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, in the free state of Pennsylvania. And that gives you some idea, first, of how unpopular the anti-slavery people were throughout the country, and second, how much racism and pro-slavery feeling there was in the North. I mean, a lot of Northerners really were making their living off slavery. If you worked in a clothing factory in the North, chances are that the cotton that you were spinning and weaving into cloth had been grown by slaves in the South. So a lot of people were profiting from slavery, even in the North. And anti-slavery people were considered to be dangerous kooks and fanatics who had to be stopped. Here's another example of that from another free state, Illinois. There was a man named Elijah P. Lovejoy. He was an evangelical. He had been converted in a revival in the Second Great Awakening. And he had moved to St. Louis, Missouri first, where he started a newspaper called The Observer. Now, the main focus of this newspaper was anti-Catholicism, but every now and then Elijah P. Lovejoy would write an article against slavery. And that drew the attention of leaders in St. Louis, in Missouri, which after all was a slave state, right? According to the Missouri Compromise of 1820, Missouri was a slave state. And so the city leaders in St. Louis told Lovejoy to get out. He said, "We don't want your kind over here." So Lovejoy said, "Well, fine, okay. I know where I'm not wanted, so I'll just take my printing press across the river, the Mississippi River, to Alton, Illinois, near St. Louis, and I'll set up my newspaper there, and the citizens of the free state of Illinois surely will welcome me." So he loaded up his printing press on a steamboat and headed upriver to Alton. Well, anyway, when he tried to unload his printing press in Alton, an angry pro-slavery mob gathered and destroyed it. Well, Lovejoy wasn't going to be defeated that easily, so he bought another printing press, tried to unload it in Alton. The same thing happened. Then it happened a third time. 3 printing presses destroyed in the free state of Illinois. Well, finally, Lovejoy decided to take matters in his own hands, and he got some of his friends together, and they formed kind of a posse, and they armed themselves with guns. And so this fourth attempt, he unloaded the printing press, and he and his friends managed to get it into a warehouse. But then the mob gathered around the warehouse and set it on fire, so that Lovejoy had to run out of the warehouse in order to avoid being burnt to death. And as soon as he set foot outside, they shot him to death. Um, the pro-slavery mob in the free state of Illinois, and you know, none of them were ever prosecuted. You couldn't find a jury to convict people because, once again, the vast majority of Americans were convinced that anti-slavery activists were dangerous and had to be stopped. So nothing was done about the murder of Elijah P. Lovejoy. Well, anyway, in spite of that, Lovejoy's death really was a turning point for the anti-slavery movement in many ways. Okay, and the anti-slavery leaders really did a very good job of putting a good PR spin on Lovejoy's death. Now, you might imagine that they would present him as a martyr for the anti-slavery cause, a martyr being someone who dies for a cause, whatever it is. Okay, but they didn't do that. They didn't present him as a martyr of anti-slavery because they knew that most white people, even in the North, didn't give two hoots about black people and their civil rights or about ending slavery. So they knew that wasn't a winning formula. So instead, they started saying that Lovejoy died to protect free speech and freedom of the press, First Amendment rights in America. And they started calling him the first martyr of free speech in America. And they began to present the theory that there was this slave power. You see the book over on the right, the cover of the book. There was a slave power in the South that was spreading its tentacles into the North and trying to choke off free speech, free press, free expression in the North, prevent Northern citizens from speaking their minds on the subject of slavery. Now, that really struck a chord with many people in the North, because even if they didn't care about African Americans and black civil rights, they did care a lot. White people in the North did care a lot about their own civil rights, and they didn't want anyone telling them what to think or what to say. And so this message really helped to recruit more and more people into the anti-slavery movement after the death of Elijah P. Lovejoy. And one result was that in 1838, petitions began pouring into Congress. Now, you know that according to the First Amendment, also we have the right to petition the government. That's a petition is usually just like a little short letter asking for something from the government, some law to be passed or some change to be made. And sometimes you'll see people on street corners getting with a clipboard asking you to sign their petition on climate change or whatever. Well, anyway, a lot of these petitions were coming in with a lot of signatures to Congress. Many of the petitions were circulated by women, and you know that made sense because, of course, women couldn't vote at this point in history, and so really all they could do was petition the government, and so they did. So a lot of these anti-slavery women were distributing these petitions and sending them to Congress. Well, Congress was dominated in many ways by Southern politicians who really were angry about the petitions and didn't want to be bothered with them. And so a policy was created in Congress known as the gag rule. And the gag rule was in effect from 1838 to 1844. Basically, under this policy, the petitions were all received by Congress, but then they were immediately tabled. That's a parliamentary maneuver, which means you just ignore it. You lay it on the table and ignore it. And so they were all the petitions basically were ignored. And all the signatures and the support that was growing for the anti-slavery movement were completely discounted for 6 years under this gag rule. But slowly, the movement began to gather momentum. All right. Well, by the way, catching up a little bit on the presidency, after Andrew Jackson stepped down in 1837. The next president was his vice president, Martin Van Buren, a Democrat. But Van Buren's presidency was overshadowed by a major economic event known as the Panic of 1837. This was basically a stock market crash, a panic on Wall Street that resulted in a major economic depression that lasted throughout Van Buren's presidency. So he wasn't really a very popular president. And in 1840, when he tried to run for re-election, he had a very popular opponent from the Whig Party, WHIG, Whig Party, the opposition party to the Democrats, in William Henry Harrison. Now, you may recall that in 1811, Harrison, as the governor of Indiana Territory, had attacked and defeated the Shawnee prophet Tenskwatawa and his supporters at the village of Prophetstown on the Tippecanoe River. And so, ever after that, William Henry Harrison was known as Old Tippecanoe. And because his running mate in this election was John Tyler of Virginia, their slogan was very catchy. It was Tippecanoe and Tyler too. So it was a good campaign slogan, and in many ways, Harrison was a very good campaigner, who used a lot of the Democrats' election methods, actually. So, for example, whenever he would have a campaign rally, they would build a log cabin because supposedly Harrison had been born in a log cabin, even though really he hadn't. And from the cabin, they would distribute hard alcoholic cider. So historians sometimes call this the log cabin election or the hard cider election. But anyway, Harrison knew how to appeal to the common folks, and he really had the common touch. And he did win the election, and he became the first Whig president. However, very interesting feature of this 1840 presidential election was the first appearance of an anti-slavery political party in America, which was known as the Liberty Party. Now, these people had broken away from William Lloyd Garrison and his belief that anti-slavery people should just stay out of politics. The Liberty Party people embraced politics. They believed in voting, they believed in running for office, they thought that was the way to end slavery or to restrict it. And furthermore, they believed that the Constitution was actually an anti-slavery document if it was read correctly. And so their position became known as radical constitutional anti-slavery. And another very interesting thing about this Liberty Party group, if you look at that picture over there, you see that it was highly unusual at the time, first of all because it was an integrated group. It had both African American and white members. In fact, you see they're sitting just to the left of that very tall man in the center of the picture, none other than Frederick Douglass, who was a member of the Liberty Party, the editor of the North Star newspaper in Rochester, New York, having escaped from slavery. A couple of groups are going to read an excerpt from his autobiography very soon. So Douglass was a member of the Liberty Party. You see other African Americans there. Also, you see quite a few women. So even though women couldn't vote, they were still valued members of the Liberty Party and helped to spread its message. Well, the Liberty Party didn't get many votes. In fact, its vote total in 1840 was so low it wasn't even recorded in the official election returns, but it was an important beginning and a precedent for later anti-slavery political parties like the Free Soil Party and then later the Republican Party, which was founded as an anti-slavery group, as we will see. All right, well, William Henry Harrison actually had the shortest presidential term in American history. 30 days. And how did that come about? Well, Harrison was pretty elderly by this point in time, and his inauguration day in March 1841 was very cold and kind of drizzly. And Harrison then went out without a coat on and gave the longest inaugural speech in American history, which ran about 2 hours. And so Harrison caught a cold, and it turned into pneumonia. And within a month of his election, William Henry Harrison was dead. And that meant that his vice president, John Tyler, became the president of the United States. But that really was a great disappointment to the Whigs. They had finally won an election, a presidential election. But as a matter of fact, John Tyler was not even really a Whig. He was basically a Democrat who had just been put on the ticket as a way to try to reach out to Southerners and win some Southern votes, because he was a slaveholder from Virginia. And so essentially President John Tyler pursued a more or less democratic agenda. Especially he was interested in expanding slavery to more regions. And the logical place to really do that, to start that project of expanding and getting more slave territory, was in Texas. Because several years before this, in 1836, the American settlers in Texas had staged a revolt against Mexico, which actually owned Texas at that time. And this was the revolution that featured the Battle of the Alamo, where Davy Crockett was killed. You may have heard of this. And so the rallying cry of the American Texans became "Remember the Alamo," and they fought and defeated the Mexican army and won their independence in 1836. And so for 9 years, actually, Texas was an independent country, the Republic of Texas. And if any of you are from Texas, I'm sure you're aware of that. Texans are very proud of this unique distinction, that they were the only state ever to have been an independent country that was recognized as such for 9 years. Sometimes this was called the Lone Star Republic. Well, anyway, in 1844, John Tyler had been trying to get Congress to annex Texas as a slave state. Tyler didn't run in 1844, but he was succeeded by a Democrat, James K. Polk of Tennessee. And under Polk, in the Polk administration, Congress did invite Texas to become a state, and Texas was admitted to the Union as a slave state in 1845, as Tyler had wanted. And it should be said here that it's interesting, in the 19th century, it was the Democratic Party that was the pro-slavery party, the racist party, the anti-black civil rights party, and the party that was very much in favor of the expansion of slavery and states' rights. And at that time, states' rights became kind of a rallying cry for the pro-slavery people. They didn't want the federal government to interfere with slavery in any way. And so they believed the states should be able to determine policies on slavery exclusively. Well, anyway, after the annexation of Texas, obviously Mexico didn't like that at all. And so the United States had to go to war with Mexico to keep Texas. And this war became known as the Mexican-American War, or sometimes just the Mexican War. And it lasted for about 2 years. The Mexican-American War was a huge victory for the United States. This was a very uneven contest. Basically, the American military just destroyed the Mexican military, took over, marched all the way to Mexico City, took it over. This was a huge success for United States troops, this Mexican-American war. And so I'm going to switch, I'll come back to this slide, but I'm going to switch over to a map here to show you the effect of this war. So as a result of the Mexican War, in 1848, Mexico had to sign a treaty where they gave the United States not only Texas, but a large amount of additional territory. There you see on the map in gold that today forms the states of California, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Arizona, Colorado, and New Mexico. This was called the Mexican Cession of 1848. They ceded the land to us. They gave it to the United States, the Mexican Cession. So under Polk, that large amount of territory came into the U.S. Also, if you look up at the northwest part of the country, that area in brown also came into the U.S. at this time because Polk negotiated a treaty with the British in Canada, which finally set the boundary between the U.S. and Canada. And so the future states of Washington, Oregon, and Idaho came into the U.S. at that time as well. And so Polk actually added more territory to the U.S. than any other president, even though he's a little-known president, more even than Jefferson with the Louisiana Purchase. And it's interesting, too, that large numbers of settlers very quickly began pouring into, especially into California, because, as you may be aware, in 1849, gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill near Sacramento in Central California, and this triggered what became known as the California Gold Rush, in which people really flooded into California from all over the world trying to cash in on this gold boom. And so that really made the question more urgent about what to do with these territories. This was the question that was hanging over all of this. The U.S. had just acquired a huge amount of new territory. What should be done with it? Should it be slave territory or free territory where slavery was banned? And that actually was the question that would tear the country apart and lead to the Civil War.